More than ever, America's Department of Defense will make a huge difference in a world grown far more dangerous. So we turn to Georgetown professor Rosa Brooks, the Harvard, Yale, and Oxford graduate and Defense Department veteran who has a clear sense of the challenges we face and the opportunities we have. The nation's defense begins with men and women willing to sacrifice their lives for all of us. So we owe it to them to make sure they have everything they need to get the job done. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
The hard things that are necessary, we either do it or we'll pay the price down the road.
That often is missing in politics.
We have to solve everything.
It's a nightmare.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
I have faith in the American people.
Those are the facts.
The Illuminati, right there. Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
What's in this tea?
Well, Professor, great to have you on the show today. I'm here with my partner, Dan McFaul. I want to give you fair warning. He comes from one of the most military-centric parts of the nation, the Florida Panhandle. He kind of knows his stuff. I'm a piker compared to him on some of these defense matters, so I'll try to keep up with both of you.
Thank you, Adam. Well, Professor Brooks, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for being here today.
Good to be here.
Let's start more broadly, if you would, just your general assessment of the state of readiness of America's military today. We had 4 years of President Trump building up of procurement and military personnel. We had the pandemic and some controversies over vaccines, and then 4 years of a Biden presidency. Give me your assessment of where we are today militarily.
Not where we should be, I think. I think the Pentagon has made a major effort to acknowledge that we're operating in a different universe than we were a decade ago in terms of anti-access area denial technologies, in terms of what the Chinese are coming up with, in terms of being able to pivot so that we can not only engage in the kinds of conventional battlefield maneuvers that we've always excelled in, but also keep up with cyber, keep up with emerging kinds of threats from AI. And I think that we've seen a real concerted effort to do that, but are we where we should be? No, I don't. Although I don't think it's for lack of trying. And Dan, you probably know better than I all the ways in which the congressional funding and the sort of nature of defense appropriations actually makes it remarkably difficult, ironically, even to cut things that don't do us any good. There's always going to be somebody in Congress standing up and say, yeah, but that employs, 13 and a half of my constituents. Don't cut that, which in turn means that we can't get rid of programs that don't do us any good. And sometimes we can't invest as much as we should in programs that we desperately need.
So you go back, to the Department of Defense in a very interesting career. I try to put the pieces together. You graduated from Harvard, Oxford, Yale. You go to the State Department. You're into academia, and more recently become a reserve police officer in the D.C. force, where you recently published Tangled Up in Blue.
I stole that from Bob Dylan. Don't tell him.
You know what? I thought I had heard that somewhere. I thought it was just me. Put those pieces together. How did your life kind of naturally lead from where you began to where you are now?
Well, as I'm sure both of you probably feel in your own lives, like life is always a series of accidents, right? You think you're going to do one thing and then something else comes along. And, in hindsight, you can always kind of stitch together some story that makes it sound like it makes sense. But frankly, it sort of doesn't necessarily. Early in my career, I worked for various human rights groups and saw really horrific things in, places like the Balkans and northern Uganda, the Lord's Resistance Army rebels who were, big on hacking children up and stuff like that. I would talk to these people who'd done these horrible things. And they were kind of like normal people, and they were totally convinced that what they had done was the right thing. And that always just seemed like such a puzzle to me. And it got me interested just from a kind of as an academic in the stories we tell ourselves that make us think what we're doing is right. We all tell ourselves that we're really good at kind of, well, I can just assess the facts and come to an objective belief, but most of us are actually really horrible at that. Some of us are worse than others, but we're all pretty crappy at it. That mostly what we do is we come up with these justifications for what we want to do. And I got interested in that, particularly when it relates to violence, the stories people tell about why our violence is okay and somebody else's violence is bad. And that got me interested in sort of military issues. It got me interested in policing issues and sort of how both sides, and even both sides, there are always like 18 sides in anything, but how everybody kind of says, well, obviously I'm right and you're a bad person.
Right.
And are there ways to get around that? Because I do think when you're talking about war, when you're talking about policing, those are issues where we see a whole lot of, obviously I'm 100% right and obviously you're 100% wrong, but the nature of the world always seems to me to be a little more complicated than that.
That's fascinating that you'd say that. I've got a good friend of mine, and she was one of the government attorneys who did some of the initial interrogations of KSM at Guantanamo Bay. KSM, of course, being the mastermind of 9/11, responsible for deaths of thousands of Americans and huge changes in the way we, board an airplane or enter a building or go into the Capitol. And I asked her one time, I said, hey, what's KSM like? And she said,
Right.
He's funny. And I thought, he's a monster. I mean, how could you say that he's funny? But she told a couple of anecdotes and, has a sense of humor. So it's fascinating kind of this dichotomy between these norms that we have out there, that someone could be this mastermind who killed thousands of Americans and be perceived as having a sense of humor. But I guess what I'm hearing you say is this is more the norm than the exception. Is that accurate?
Well, just, you think about the things that we think of as the worst atrocities in human history, things like the Holocaust or, the Rwandan genocide, the Cambodian genocide, Stalin's, gulags and so on. And you find a handful of really evil people, right? You find a handful of people who are just like, yeah, I like killing people and I like suffering. I like inflicting suffering. But most people aren't like that. Most people are like, oh, wow, I don't want to hurt anybody, but either I'm scared. If I don't go along with this, I will be at risk. My children will be at risk. I'd rather hurt somebody else than have my children hurt or risk my own life. Or they convince themselves like, well, it's dirty work, but it's bad. But, the ends justifies the means. And for the sake of, a better future, unfortunately, I'm just, I'm going to have to go along with this stuff. It's unpleasant, but someone's got to do it. And that's a way that we've seen over and over and over, that perfectly ordinary, decent, nice humans who in a different world would never hurt a fly,
Right.
end up committing these terrible, terrible crimes.
What challenges are new today that you're looking at and seeing on the outside that you were dealing with hands-on on the inside not that many years ago?
I think the biggest challenge is that no matter how many times we tell ourselves the world is changing, like our brains just don't want to keep up with that, right? And we still are, so many of us, especially, I don't want to make any assumptions about your ages here, but, those of us who are not millennials, right? We didn't grow up in the digital age. We still our kind of association when we think of war is a bunch of guys with tanks, right? And that still happens, right? We've been seeing it in places like Syria and Ukraine over the last decade, obviously. That kind of, just grueling, miserable trench battles with artillery and so forth. But equally, we now are facing, nanotechnologies and swarms of nano drones that are connected to each other through software that enables them to communicate in real time much faster than any human brain could possibly keep up. We have seen Russian and Chinese embrace of gray zone warfare, where we're seeing adversaries make use of not only proxies, which is obviously old news, but really much more sophisticated efforts to incorporate disinformation into their overall global strategies, to incorporate various kinds of economic and political pressures. On the one hand, it's not new, right? Nations and states and non-state actors, including what we'd call terror groups or insurgencies, have always tried to use every tool available. But we have a lot more tools available to cause mischief. And the structure of our military, the structure of our government is very siloed. We're not super good at sort of connecting the dots between, well, what is the State Department doing? What is the CIA doing? What is the military doing? We're large and we're clunky. And that just means that when we're facing adversaries who, frankly, are unhampered by the inconveniences of being democracies, right? It's a lot easier if you don't have to bother with a Congress, with some kind of representative government, if you don't have to bother with pesky things like laws. And so I think, they always say democracies fight with one hand tied behind their back. I personally would not change that, right? I would rather have a democracy, as clunky and inefficient as it sometimes is, than live under a totalitarian state. But no question about it, there are ways in which we do need to shake up our defense establishment and our executive branch more generally, and Congress.
What professor would be at the top of that list of shaking things up? Because, we're just talking about technology, for instance. I think it's very clear to everybody that technology is changing everything. And one thing the government is not good at is keeping up with technology. Technology is
Yeah.
outracing government's ability to legislate in a way where it's not hindering it, it's actually reinforcing it.
It's such a tricky issue, and I don't have a great answer for you, right? And actually, one of the things I do like about Mike Waltz, for instance, our new national security advisor, is I think he is very thoughtful on these issues. And he and I were both involved in some efforts at the New America called the Future of War Initiative 10, 12 years ago, trying to kind of think through those types of technological challenges. And one of the things I do think we need to do is we need to get better at forging public-private partnerships, because the pay scale to work in government, and we all know this is not how you get rich, as it should be. It should be motivated by service and patriotism. But at the same time, what that means is that top talent goes to the private sector. We're not very good at tapping it. We need to make sure, on the one hand, I don't think we want to sell the United States government to a corporation, right? That the United States government should not be and is not about enriching individuals. But at the same time, if we can't compete and we don't have robust links to private sector actors, we do fall behind. And another thing, boy, okay, let me just wade right into an issue that I know is on everybody's minds right now, which is the sort of, diversity, DEI, et cetera. Here's another just built-in challenge for our military, for our intelligence communities, for our tech sector, our private tech sector. Americans have not kept up educationally, by and large, with citizens from other countries, which means that if you want to do the super cool high-tech stuff and you want to get the smartest people, very often they're coming from other countries. Frankly, you're looking at a lot of people who, even if they're U.S. citizens, were often born and have close ties elsewhere. We have a security clearance system that makes it really tough to hire those guys in the government, to work with those people. It's a built-in trade-off, that the more you take security risks, the more you gain in terms of actual knowledge, and vice versa. I don't think we've gotten it right, though. And, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think this is the point people like Elon Musk have actually made pretty powerfully. You want to make it harder in a range of ways for us to tap the top talent from around the globe. We're shooting ourselves in the foot.
So since World War II, the traditional branches of the military, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, have viewed the world as global regions. But now we have Space Force, and it's beginning to grow and mature as a service branch. How do we adjust to these, and how do you see DoD adapting to this?
It's a great question. It's real. And again, it's so hard, right? Because all the talk about sort of a deep state, like it's something sort of the sinister conspiracy, I think is nonsense. But bureaucracies do what bureaucracies do, right? And what bureaucracies do is they get self-sustaining. It doesn't matter who sets it up or with what original purpose. I think in some ways, like DoD is actually more agile than, for instance, our State Department when it comes to change. But one of the problems is DoD needs to talk to the State Department, because we want to be leveraging all those so-called instruments of national power in a kind of coordinated way. And so you're trying to coordinate all those various tools you've got. And literally, you've got executive branch departments that don't speak the same language bureaucratically, and they sort of can't talk to each other. So there's so many things that are in the way. Although I do just want to say, as a Gen Xer who grew up saying things like, "You're such a space cadet," that I'm so happy that now we actually have space cadets.
So they used to use the term space cadet for different reasons.
Different reasons, yes.
Right.
Yes, different
So,
reasons.
Professor, you wrote this book back in 2016, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything. And you made a point in that book about kind of the blurring or even the erasing of the line between war and peace. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about our kind of fantasy version of war, and again, I think for a lot of, especially older people, that comes, World War II and movies. Wars have clear beginnings, they have clear ends. You know where the war is, you know who's in the war because they're helpfully wearing uniforms. And that was never completely true, right? There's never been a period in history where we haven't had sort of on the margins all kinds of messiness and blurriness. You have guerrillas, you've got partisans, you've got spies, you've got proxy wars where one state is funding the military of another state to fight with the military of a third state in order to piss off a fourth state, right? And so there's, and again, not totally new, but I think that what we saw accelerating rapidly after 9/11, although again, it sort of goes back before it, you've got all kinds of actors. You got these like terror groups like Al-Qaeda. It's not a country, it's a bunch of people. So they weren't a state, they weren't a military, they weren't using what we think of traditionally as weapons. You got a bunch of guys with box cutters hijacking civilian planes and doing more damage to the United States than any attack since Pearl Harbor. and they scatter all over the place, and so all of our kind of legal framework, our conceptual framework, our sort of political framework for thinking about conflict gets kind of turned upside down. And then you add to that things like the, future possibilities, bioengineered warfare of various sorts, or, DNA-linked warfare, or warfare that is primarily done through semi-autonomous weapon systems, drones, and so forth. And you suddenly discover that, well, how do you decide, where's the war? Who's in the war? Who's a combatant? Who's a civilian? And I think for some time now, we've been in that universe in which there's still plenty of things that are kind of obvious. You get a Ukrainian guy wearing a Ukrainian uniform driving a tank. He's in the Ukrainian military, right? He's fighting the Russians. No, it's not complicated.
Right.
But on the other hand, are we in an armed conflict right now with North Korea? What about Yemen? I mean, there's so many areas where it's frankly pretty blurry. And I'm a law professor, right? So we like things to be nice and clear. We're always sort of like, well, yes, is it an armed conflict or is it not an armed conflict? And increasingly, we're in a situation where everybody just spends a lot of time sitting around scratching their heads because, you can't really jam things into these categories anymore.
I think that's a profound point. I mean, it's really true. If you look at what's happening in Gaza, what's happened since October 7th in Israel, Hamas is not a country. It's an organization. And this has been a reoccurring trend throughout modern warfare in the 21st century. Thinking about that, the IG at the Department of Defense identified the major challenges that are facing our military infrastructure, and they highlighted military readiness. They talked about strengthening our relationships with allies and our partners, both in NATO and non-NATO, strengthening their capabilities. And the other thing that was mentioned that I think is probably the most interesting, and I know you've got some experience in this area, is the quality of life for the warfighter and for the military families. Which one of these is the most pressing, and how do we best achieve that?
Boy, I mean, they're all interconnected, right?
Right.
You can spend all your time and money making sure military personnel have the best training, the best equipment, et cetera, et cetera. But if the deployment tempo is so great that their families are falling apart, they're going to have problems. We are dependent on our allies in all kinds of ways that we may have still the strongest military in the world, but our population, the size of our military, is finite, partly because of the way we define it, because we want to have the best of the best. You can't just stroll into a recruiting station and say, hey, here I am. For various reasons, 75% of young people, for instance, are not even eligible to join the military. Health reasons, educational reasons, criminal record, et cetera. It's a huge problem, which means in turn that one of the things that is actually very efficient for the United States, speaking of efficiency, is to leverage the capabilities of other countries, which, yes, does mean that sometimes we got to put some pressure on them to make sure that they have a high state of readiness. But that's a force multiplier for us. Those alliances are huge force multipliers to be able to say, you know what, we don't have to do that, but the Brits could do that, or the Germans could do that, or the French could do that, or whoever could do that. And then, no, I can't. I think I got to everything on your list.
Yeah, you did. You touched on everything. And there's been a decrease in strength over the years. And some of that is intentional and some of that is purposeful. AI and machines and technology can do the things that used to be up to the warfighter to do. But as you mentioned, recruiting and retention still continue to remain problems and issues that DoD is fighting out there. The other thing that I think is interesting has been, post-World War II, going away towards traditional armies and just, marching lines of troops out there. We've become very special operations centric, and there's been a lot more joint operations out there. Now, all the service branches have special operators, and we have a special operations command. Do you see this trend continuing, and does this negate the need for having separate branches, or does it make sense to consolidate? What do you think the future looks like with respect to that?
I mean, I think we have seen, as you said, a steady increase in sort of turning to special operations forces across all the branches, and through Special Operations Command, increasingly many missions will pull together a mix of, there may be Navy SEALs and Green Berets supported by, Air Force folks and MARSOC folks on the same team.
Yep.
And that's a good thing. I mean, I think that's the kind of jointness that we need, is that we should be pulling people based on the unique capabilities they bring and how suited they are to a particular mission. I always get this joke wrong because frankly, you could phrase this in a bunch of different ways. It's sort of like, I understand why our Army has an Air Force, but I don't understand, why our Navy's Army has an Air Force. And, that sort of arbitrariness, like, I mean, you kind of go, oh, wait, we've got the Army, but then we've also got the Marines who are kind of like the Army, except they're not. And then we've got the Air Force, except then we've got all these naval aviators. in some magic utopian world, right, where we were sort of saying, let's design this whole thing from scratch based on current, technologies and current security challenges, would you design it like this? Of course not. It's bananas to design it like this. And I think the only real question, and this is actually something that my former boss when I was at the Pentagon was Michelle Flournoy, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the time. And I remember when I was arguing passionately to her for some kind of internal reorganization at some point, and she said to me, you know what, I think people get a little too obsessed with sort of formal organizational lines. And when you've got the right people, the org chart doesn't matter. And when you've got the wrong people, the org chart won't help you. And, that doesn't make sense to sometimes reorganize. But I've thought a lot about that since, because nothing in the world is frictionless.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, the only thing that worries me about your conversation, the two of you, I'm thinking Army-Navy football game. I mean, we have to maintain tradition here, Professor, whatever we do. So,
and you're thinking whether they have an Air Force or a Navy, they still need a football team.
Exactly right.
So on the human rights side of things, there's the UN, there's WHO, there's NATO, there's these national worldwide organizations that all have human rights standards and councils that enforce it to various degrees. How big is America's moral obligation to enforce and prevent human rights atrocities? And what are some strategies that this administration or future administration can employ to help minimize this?
I don't know. This is a really hard moment for people who care about human rights because the United States, our appetite and desire to do good in the world has greatly exceeded our capacity and the sophistication and understanding. And sometimes we've ended up doing more harm than good. I think back to Iraq or Afghanistan, and I sometimes wonder, well, if we had done 6 months and then just said, okay, got al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, got rid of Saddam Hussein, bye-bye now, might those countries be in better shape now than if we did what we did, which is stick around forever and ever, often screwing things up with the best possible intentions. So I think that we should be much more humble than we've been in the past. I think that the delusion that because we're such nice people, we're Americans, right, that we can just kind of solve everybody's problem is a delusion. But I also don't think that that can or should mean that there's never a role for us, including occasionally a role for military action for humanitarian purposes. And again, this is another don't throw the baby out with the bathwater situation, that I think Americans are quite right to sort of go like, oh boy, we've seen that story before. Don't tell us that we're going to bring democracy and human rights and peace and love to everybody around the world at vast, vast expense when meanwhile we've got all these problems here at home. But I think there are times when a, relatively limited set of actions, including military actions, can actually make a pretty, give other people a chance that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Well, I'll tell you, this conversation should remind everybody, we are in a world community. We talk about politics here in this country. Most of it seems to be very domestic, but, foreign policy and Department of Defense and national security all goes into the fact that we are a part of a bigger thing. And I appreciate not only your insights and your experience in kind of informing those insights, but the fact that your life, I would describe it as a book with many chapters. To try to answer the question I posed, I think you answered it. You're continuing to write new chapters, not only in your life, but I think the country is continuing to write new chapters for itself. And I think the journey of that is going to hopefully put us in a much better place and hopefully a more peaceful place. Thank you very much for your time. And again, I'm for everything except for touching Army-Navy. If anyone goes after that tradition, I'm having real issues.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm married to a retired Army officer, and he would agree with you on that one.
Take care of yourself. Thanks for spending time with us.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you both so much.